Ciao, ciao. Good evening to everyone, and welcome to this evening event. We are very glad to welcome Yves Moreau by Studio Moto here, and it's a pleasure for us to have you here. I just make a very short introduction. I'm sure almost all of you know the firm. It's a very known one with an international background. But just to underline some points, I think it's also interesting because this evening it's in a way a conference that probably shifts a bit what you have already listened about the topic of the workshop. But we thought it was important and interesting to have an architectural approach to some questions that are, I think, Yves will touch in his lecture. Studio Moto is an architectural office based in Paris and founded by Yves and Gilles Delalex in 2003. It's an activity that crosses architecture, urban design, and also research, as far as I have seen and read in many sources. Moto means form in Finnish. And also I think it's quite interesting the approach that the studio had, almost and mostly work with minimal structure, rough material, in a way try to combine them to find a solution to different design problems that are, of course, occurring when we are dealing with the question of the design. Yves has an international background, if I'm not wrong, and he graduated in Brussels, but also studied in Gothenburg. So I think it's also quite interesting to see the journey and the different experience that he brought to us. I'm not taking much time out of that, and I leave the word to Yves for his lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I will try to have my best international English so that everybody understands. I have a few notes because English is always a bit more difficult.
Devo o spengo il microfono ambientale o spengo quello. Quale spengo? Okay. Sorry. It's all right.
So the introduction was quite nice, and yeah, we've been traveling with my partners all over Europe, and then one day we crossed paths in a way along the journey in Paris, and then we started working together in a kind of a big office in Paris, and then before starting our own practice. So we've been working for about 20, a bit more than 20 years together now, and indeed we work with maybe minimal structures research, but maybe also a lot with infrastructure, and that's why I think your theme of today about this kind of road via Emilia. I mean, we try to reorganize a bit the lecture so we kind of talk about a journey, a road trip, and what's happening along the road. So actually the lecture is a road trip. The road trip, it also talks about freedom, because we, as architects, we ask ourselves, can architecture be a means of freedom? And it's maybe I made two kind of lines during the lecture. It's this kind of idea of freedom in architecture and the idea of infrastructure. And so we're trying to gather a little story around these two topics. So, and to start this small story, I mean, I don't know if you know, small platform. It's a platform in on the coastline of England, in the Thames. It's a kind of a part of a Mounsell fort. This kind of military constructions in the Thames during World War II. that were able to kind of defend England from the German potential invasions and the planes, etc. And it's the story of this small platform called Sealand, and it's quite an amusing story because it's a very small platform and it's like it's not so far away from the coastline, but it is a quite, I mean, this is kind of an element, kind of a public element from the nation, England defending the nation. And until one day, there was a kind of ex-Navy guy, Paddy Rogue Bates, he kind of realized that these structures was in international water. He said, oh, interesting. So maybe I can take possession of this platform. So it was, oh, why can he do that? And these structures, I mean, the structure we thought they were quite nice because it's kind of a boat at these kind of two big towers, and then they sink it on the sand into the waters. And on the platform on top, you had this kind of small construction. You had a radar system. You had this kind of anti-aircraft guns. And so the guy one day said, okay, maybe I can possess this construction because it doesn't belong to England. So why can't I possess it? So he says, okay, I make a kingdom of Sealand and I become the prince and my wife becomes the princess. And so he kind of recreates all the attributes of a nation on this small construction. His own currency, his own passport, national anthem, and kind of everything represents a state. But of course, the British, they didn't like it. So they sent the army, said, we want to reclaim this piece. But then it was like in the news, and it was like a whole event. So they defended their small piece of nation that they kind of recreated. That's why they call it kind of a micronation, kind of a very small nation. And there are actually many of these kind of small nations around the world. Like we could proclaim ourselves a kind of micronation here and say, okay, we build a whole kind of a set of law, etc. But then the only difference is that you should be recognized by the other nations as well. So there is a difference between this micronation that wasn't really we wasn't really accepted by the other nations. So this is what the prince and the princess, and so well, it really made their nation on this small, beautiful. It's a beautiful structure by itself architecturally. Section of and you have the water, you have the water level here, and so it's underwater, and it's leaking out. So the structure itself is really, really, really nice. That brings us back to this idea of freedom, and maybe there are architectural elements that kind of more than others call for freedom. So we could think of these architectures of barricades. Okay, this is an art installation, but in Paris, when they had all these kind of revolutions, they made a kind of a manual on how to make barricades and how to place them in the specific streets and how you should build them to defend a kind of a neighborhood. So there is really a kind of certain types of architecture that maybe call for appropriation, that call for freedom, and that call for kind of maybe a revolution in a way. And then you think of, okay, all the Arab revolutions a few years ago, it all started on the roundabouts. So what would we think when you build a roundabout for cars that it would become a starting point for a revolution? And not so long time ago, I think in France, 2 years ago, when we had the yellow vest crisis, I mean, they also started on the roundabout. So why are certain elements, architecture or infrastructural elements, more subject to be and how would they appeal for more freedom, and why? How did it come? And that's a real question. How do architectural elements call for freedom? And so we try to investigate over the years, because it's a kind of a long subject we've been working on kind of also relate to public notion of publicness of buildings and infrastructures. And so we try to investigate different kind of practices of freedom. And I mean, certain are more radical than others, and more, but I mean, we try to investigate them along the work we have been doing over the years. So, I mean, the first one is the idea of having a serialism, to work with series and to work with a very strong constraint of a kind of a grid, or kind of a structural element, kind of repetitive structural element, and to see how from that structural element, kind of this constraint, this grid, how life comes over it. How can you create kind of a messy confrontation? And this is an installation we did in Paris, in the Cité de l'Architecture. It's the it's kind of the station place for architecture. It's really like depending directly from the Minister of Culture, the place, you know, kind of institution. And they asked to do a small intervention, and then we said, like, you know, it was just after the COVID, one of the COVID confinement, everything was closed, and we said, yeah, well, we don't know exactly what we should do, but maybe we should, instead of doing a very small intervention, maybe we should, you know, have a look at your archives and see what kind of stuff you have, because maybe it's interesting. And so we went with them to their archives and went to the basement and the storage spaces, and they have huge amount of text boxes, you know, for the models, but like hundreds of them, and or frames to display plans, or kind of lamps, stuff like that, and even also models from other exhibitions. And then we said, okay, maybe it's time to do a big spring cleaning, you know, reopening of the Cité de l'Architecture, and say, I mean, we don't want to come and put our all in the Cité like an opening. Maybe you have already a lot of stuff. And so we said, okay, we take the whole space, and we lay out a kind of a big grid with tape, you know, on over the walls, the floors, the furniture, the windows. I think we have 5 kilometers of tape in the whole building. It took 1 week to install. But the idea was to say, okay, we lay out a kind of a big virtual shelf in your house, in your Cité d'Architecture, and say, okay, and now it's your turn to work, and you go and get in your archives, and you take the pieces out, and you say, oh, this piece is interesting, this I want to show, this I want to show, oh no, this is not so interesting. So it was a whole process of getting them a bit active as well. I mean, we went even, you know, inside the toilets, etc. It was a bit of a crisis relation, because they didn't expect something like this. And of course, they were very afraid of the what would happen if we would remove the tape of the floors and the wall. And you had, you know, you had this kind of colors, graffitis already on the wall from before, and so they were not so happy until one day President Macron came, just one day before the opening, and came to the space, and everything was almost finished. Said, oh yeah, well, this is really interesting. And from that moment, I said, okay, we keep it. And I think now it's still there, and I think they're a bit annoyed, because I'm afraid that when they will remove the tape, I mean, it will take away the paint. But anyway, it's kind of a, what was kind of an interesting idea to kind of have this confrontation between this repetitive grid and this existing space, which is quite messy, and you had this kind of rough ceiling, and you have this paint, etc. So it was quite okay, and it even kind of I think even the grid kind of emphasized the building as it was before we intervened in the space. I mean, the grid is, of course, it can be seen as a top-down principle. I mean, kind of this map, you know, of France, But I could also think of the maps of Thomas Jefferson when he laid out the whole grid on America, you know, when they was kind of looking for the far west, and it was a way to divide the country and divide the lands between different owners, and it was a kind of a way to extend to yeah, it was really extend and go to the far west. But then again, the grid can be seen as a kind of something coming from below, kind of bottom up. And this is a project we did in Montpellier. It's in the south of France, and it's a kind of an office building for kind of innovative young technical companies. And so the idea was to say, okay, we have a site, we have the plot line, which was really like this with curve and everything. So, okay, we need to find a system that can work for office spaces. So we went for a 12 by 12 meter grid because 12 meters you can have a different kind of configurations of office spaces. And so we defined a kind of a huge chessboard with an alternation of working space 12 by 12, a technical core, and voids. I mean, or it's interior or exterior. So we have this kind of, it's a real chessboard with all these kind of different spaces. And here the idea is to work with, on the idea of repetition. And what we said is that, okay, you know, the space, okay, even if it's a 12 by 12 meter grid, the idea is that each space should be different. And it's actually the repetition of different spaces that would make the whole building. Because from the outside, it's quite a kind of, and there it's still quite open, but now it has a lot of kind of sun protection around and stuff. So it is a quite closed building. So it's really kind of an inner landscape. And so the idea was really to develop all these different kind of spaces. And actually the most interesting spaces are the ones where we have accidents or where we have spaces that were not planned or where we have the curve hitting this kind of a grid and we have this kind of, oops, what should I do now? And it's usually all these accidents in this kind of spaces and this grid that kind of are really, really interesting. So we kind of designed different workspaces, different, I mean, exterior, kind of patio, can be a kind of a meeting room. It can be a kind of a closed, how to call it, skylight. But it's really, really the same kind of grid. And so these are a few pictures from the construction. It is actually a space where the differences of the different grids is really important because it's a way to spatialize yourself. Because if everything the same, I mean, you get lost in the building completely. During the construction, it was like, oh, where should I go, etc. So that's why we really promoted for the client. I mean, to the client, okay, try to keep, and do whatever you want, but try to keep each floor as different as possible. And it was really important that the repetition of the differences would remain, even if we have, well, not so much control of what they want to do. But it's really, we kind of pushed really for it, and we try to really make sure also that especially the configurations of the workspaces were different. So they were kind of forced to have differences. And so the idea was, it was really kind of a simple idea of having this a kind of a technical core with 4 working spaces around connected to the core. And so the idea was to say, okay, you know, companies can expand and grow, etc. And so we had kind of an infinite chessboard, and then it was just cut on the limits of the site. So it's rather minimalistic inside, but because it had to be flexible, but highly flexible, and so it's extremely extremely difficult to make a very flexible space. And also we had no money, so you know that's why all the ceilings, all the technique is visible. We had huge fights with, I think, like, we had huge fights with the clients because of money, and so we had to, I mean probably like on every project, but so we had to really decide what we wanted to keep and what we could kind of well, remove. Okay, there were inside, and what you see, and what's in the black concrete blocks is all these technical cores. And then yeah, well, then you have different configurations of double height and along inside patios, outside patios, and of course the technical. I mean, the design of the of the roof of the ceiling and all these technical parts. I was so it was really important because okay, from the moment we said okay, we have no money to do something else, so we have to design them. So it was really a lot of work also with the company that made all the technical parts, and they were quite happy of the results. And they were, I mean, the first time they kind of could show their work in a way. So it was a quite a good relation with the different building companies. So just going through, the building is now finished. I think they just finished now the inside of the the furniture, etc. So the building is going to be fully occupied end of the year. Another grid, which is probably a rather important one. It's the grid, it's network of highways in Europe, and I think it's probably one of the most radical urban spaces that have been created. This network of highways, and 20 years ago, my partner Gilles, he was doing his PhD in Finland, and he worked on the highway. So he went for a trip for 3 months all over Europe. And going through all the countries and just living on the highways for 3 months, and going highways and visiting the petrol, the gas station, and trying to analyze, how different are they, or are they the same, or what is it actually? And it was actually a study. It started on standardization. I mean, they are all standard because the cars should drive all over Europe, so you could work. And you should be able to buy food. You should be able to sleep in certain spaces, or you should be able to. Just to fill your car with gas. So it was a kind of a work on the series as well, where each architectural element was kind of analyzed in a series of pictures. And in a way, you realize that even if they are standard, they're very, very different. And the more pictures we took from these standard elements, the more realized they were different. And there was another thing that was quite amusing or kind of interesting when doing the research, is that we kind of realized that there is a kind of a social life on the highway and the petrol gas stations, which is rather different than in a normal city. So we started to think, okay, maybe this is a real urban space. It has a really probably specific social rule, a very strange one, probably sometimes also because of anonymity, because maybe you don't stay long. And it's also a place where you have a lot of, especially at the borders, you have a lot of traffic, kind of illicit trafficking between the countries. You have prostitution, you have drugs, or you have families going on holidays to the south of France. So it was a kind of a quite interesting approach of seeing this space, this urban space, as almost kind of a moving city with its own own social rules. And it reminded us the work of Edward Ruscha. He published in 1962 a book called 26 Gasoline Stations. I mean, Edward Ruscha was an artist, and he lived in Los Angeles, and he wanted to go to visit his mother in Oklahoma City. So he took his car, and on the way, on the road trip, he crossed 26 gasoline stations. So he took a picture of each of the stations, and just with picture, a name, station, just because he thought they were beautiful. And one of them actually, not this one, but another one with a big standard on it, became also a base of a series of paintings he did afterwards. So he worked a lot on series, and I mean he did this work, but he did, for instance, also work on apartments of Los Angeles, where he did a series of pictures of them, and also of a book called 34 parking lots. And so he just took pictures of parking lots. I mean, he asked a kind of a helicopter pilot to take the picture for him, because he said, I mean, it's not about the quality of the framing of the picture, it's about the subject. And so he worked on this series, and it was quite interesting, because he says, you know, this from learning from, but this is 10 years later. So he kind of says, Edward Ruscha, that it's not the sign, no, the signage or the kind of the architecture, or the uniqueness of the architecture. He says what makes it unique is the repetition, and the repetition makes the project unique. And it was quite interesting that in the repetition you can find a unique project, and it's not just one sign. And then he says another thing, and it's what we realized when Gilles did the road trip across Europe, is that yes, I mean the road and the highways, I mean it's a real living city. It's not just any longer a city and another city, because they're linked together now. And so when I look at your via Emilia, I mean it's a bit like that. You have a lot of things happening, and it's and the city. Well, I mean this road belongs. It doesn't belong to the city on the left or on the right, at the beginning or the end. It's almost an element on its own. Oh, sorry. Okay, and so we thought, okay, along this road trip, maybe we can identify a few subjects, a few architectural elements that we kind of like, that we kind of try to study in our own work, and for instance, we can talk about start the phantom crowd, you know, because it's almost a picture of Edward Ruscha taking, you know, the parking lots, and I think this kind of spaces they're quite interesting, because if you put them from far away, you only see a kind of a moving painting of cars. You know, people are cars. It's the same. It's one flow of elements, and they kind of kind of organize along this pattern of parking spaces. From far away, you don't know the people. You don't see the people. Just see the kind of moving cars. So you imagine kind of a crowd there. But when you look from really close, you kind of see that maybe there are stains on the pavement. There are kind of leftovers from groceries that fell or something like that. And so, well, yeah, maybe there is something different. And what's also quite interesting is that these kind of spaces can be completely full of people, but they can be completely empty. And so, and that's quite interesting, because, and also when you think of highways, I mean, sometimes they're completely empty, and then mid of August, all the Germans and the French, they go to France, and it's like full of people. And so these kind of public spaces that are really empty or really full, I mean, the contrast is really, really interesting. And actually, when they're empty, maybe they call for appropriation for something else. And so maybe, okay, here you have a kind of a baseball court on the parking. So it gives the opportunity, kind of unexpected opportunity to appropriate the space differently. This is an image from the movie Tron. And actually, yeah, all this work on the grid and this kind of infrastructure kind of made us think of this movie. And I talked a bit earlier about the Jefferson grid, and actually this is a really metaphor of the Jefferson grid. And actually what the movie says is that this virtual world is maybe the new Far West, the kind of a digital Far West, because when Jefferson laid out the grid, I mean, completely on the west, it came to the mountains, and you had the Indians, the local people, so there was like no way to divide the grid any longer, and so I think it was quite funny reference to this grid system. And we thought about this grid when we were asked to do a project for a data center. It was kind of a virtual project. I mean, it was a real project, but it didn't have a fixed location. So we said, okay, I mean, we need to find a kind of idea, kind of what we call in French imaginaire, like we should we start, or what kind of story should we tell? And so, okay, we thought about the parking, because we needed to have cars, you know, and around this building. And then we said, okay, maybe we'll lay out a grid by, I don't know, 3 by 3 meters, something like that. And then we can organize the whole data center inside this grid, and it becomes a parking, and it became a kind of a principle of a development of a data center. It could be used in different locations. The proposal wasn't, well, we didn't, but shortly after we were asked to do a small office project in the suburbs of Paris, close to the airport. It's a huge kind of industrial area with big warehouses. You have a lot of trucks, etc. So they want there. And so the plot is not very big, but so, and it needed park. So we said, okay, we'll lay out a kind of a black asphalt around, and then we have a kind of smaller box, kind of a homot on the side. And it's a really very simple project. It's just 500 square meters and very big, kind of an open plan system, and kind of with a central kind of a distribution with a kind of toilets, etc. So a very, very simple project. But then we said, okay, maybe the places can be, the parking spaces can be aligned to the structure and the grid structure of the building. So it's a very minimalistic project, very small, very minimalistic. So we said, I mean, we cannot play on a lot of elements. So we said, I mean, here you see the site. I mean, we are a small here during construction. So we are a very small project actually in this huge area where it's full of trucks and warehouses, etc. So it's a very, it's kind of, I mean, and you see it's maybe slightly in the section. I mean, there was a slope, there was a slight slope on the side, and it allowed us to kind of work with this kind of a regular kind of a grid system for the facade. But you see on the base and on the top, it's really kind of deformed because it kind of just follows slightly the topography of the terrain. But it's very, very kind of subtle, and it's kind of almost a mission building, completely black glass, these kind of aluminum frames, and it's kind of a opaque glass on top, and it's kind of tinted glass on the bottom. So it's really kind of minimalistic, so it doesn't stay very much. But it was interesting because it started reflecting the whole neighborhood. So it was quite, well, kind of there was some effects were quite interesting. And then we have this kind of landscape, this landscape around, so a very minimalistic building. And then maybe we can have another kind of a object or kind of a architectural element which try to experiment or investigate. And it's a concrete island. And what we call concrete island is, you know, this leftover spaces under or beneath or next to kind of infrastructural elements. You know, these infrastructural elements, they're really kind of signs of the modernity, you know, of the expansion of the people and going from one side to the other side of Europe and have a big highway, etc. Everybody hates to look at the picture, but everybody takes them when they go on holiday. So there was a real kind of a funny situation there. But you have this kind of leftover spaces, and well, we think they're quite interesting, and we like dealing in a way with them. And these leftover spaces remind us the story of Concrete Island of Ballard. I don't know if you know the story, but he's an architect, and he drives this nice Jaguar on the suburb of London, and then he has a car accident, and then he falls off. He falls off the highway, and he falls down in kind of a in between space, and he's injured, and well, he ends up. It's like an island; he cannot escape. So of course he's afraid. He wants to climb the kind of the back to the highway, but he doesn't manage. He kind of is confronted to a kind of a life in this island, very strange, with strange people. Of course, he's afraid, but then he starts to have some sympathy with the people living there, and then but he wants to, and it's a kind of introspective story also, because I mean he can almost still see his apartment a bit further, and he cars, and it's a real reflection. What is modernity and how we should react to it? And probably, I mean, it seems very critical on modernity, but probably Ballard, I mean, he probably liked it very much, but he said, like, come on, wake up, guys. I mean, otherwise it's really going to be messy. So you really should do something about it. And so if we go on a bit on this idea of infrastructure, this is a picture of the movie of Pierrot Le Fou. It's a movie of Godard, 65, so it's a few years back. And it's a funny story. It was, I mean, Jean-Paul Belmondo and Anna Karina, they are purchased by arm dealers. So it's really a road trip. So they leave Paris and the south of France. And then somewhere on the way out of Paris, they find a kind of a piece of infrastructure, of a bridge also, we don't know exactly. And then we see the car, and people have already had a car accident, and said, okay, maybe we should kind of stage our own death, and so the people will not kind of follow us any longer. So they kind of put the cars, and it's kind of they stage your own death and put everything on fire. But as the camera kind of pulls back, you realize that, but I mean, they will never believe it. It's a car accident in the middle of nowhere and along a piece of infrastructure that's lost there. So it's really absurd. And probably also Godard there, it's like a bit of a criticism of this kind of modern infrastructure. And what is also quite funny, that this piece of infrastructure, it really exists, and you still can visit it in the suburbs of Paris. And if we're just a bit further, we have our own piece of infrastructure that we placed in the suburbs. It is our building in Saclay. It's a campus where it was kind of a real big state project where they decided to place all the kind of research and the big universities outside of Paris because they were lacking space inside of Paris. So we thought maybe another way to think of freedom is to have inside the architecture spaces that are not programmed. We call them inner wasteland spaces where no, there is no function, so we don't know what to do with it. So we just have voids. And for instance, here we have the first floor there. It's a space. Well, we didn't know exactly what to place there. And this is the campus. It's a huge campus, and we were one of the first one of the first buildings, Centrale, made by OMA. But she came, I mean, all this came way up. We came mostly kind of fields everywhere, etc. So it was really kind of also a kind of an urban statement to say the first building on the campus is going to be a public building. And at the same time, it should kind of suggest what would come next, all the urbanity that would come next. So we had to find a kind of intensity of functions, of structural elements that would kind of suggest everything what would come afterwards. So it is made as a huge kind of a shelf where we have a lot of different functions. And also all the unprogrammed spaces that I talked about. And for instance, one of the elements of, in a way, freedom we took when we did the competition is that we said, maybe we should remove the entrance hall. Because by removing the entrance hall and making the public accessible from the street 24 hours a day, it means that each of the different functions that we have inside the building become accessible whenever they open. And so it's not like one guy holding the key of the whole building and then, oh, the building is closed, you cannot use it, or the building is open, okay, you can enter. So we said because there are different functions and we said they work on different times of the day. You have a small cafeteria on the ground. It's almost like this kind of small petrol station shops that are always open, etc. So they open really early in the morning and till really late in the evening. Then you have logistical part because I mean the project seems easy, but everything is upside down, and so it was technically very difficult to realize. Because we said maybe we want to have the big dining room up there and on the first, I mean, not on the first floor, but on the second floor, and it has a double height. So it means that we have a huge dining room there, and so the kitchen had to be on this level. So the kitchen is divided into 2 levels, and so it was really kind of technically complicated to organize. But then again, interesting because it makes the circulation inside the building much more interesting. Then we have inside sports up there, and the basketball courts on top. And what you see in the middle, here is kind of it's a staircase, but it's an exterior staircase which is connected to the ground floor and to the urban space on both sides of the building. And the idea was really to kind of extend the ground floor inside the building and have a kind of a vertical street. This is, for example, the inner wrist, and we kept, and we had nothing, so we said, maybe it can become a kind of where it can meet, or it can become a kind of exhibition space. We didn't know, but it was interesting to leave these kind of voids inside the building. And the staircase becomes really important because it becomes a vertical street, and this vertical street, well, and it's much wider what would be required by regulation. But we said, okay, it should be really a bit excessive because there are students going up there, and maybe we'll use it in a way a bit different than what we thought. But we have to give them the opportunity. And we were very happy that even when the building was not completely finished, the students kind of climbed on the fences to go to the roof and play basketball. So it was really, I was kind of satisfying that they really kind of took possession of the building. And of course, it's a cool space up there on the roof, and you have a nice view on the whole surrounding landscape. Spatially, it's quite complex because this staircase you see a bit on the right, it's in the middle of the project, but sometimes it's completely outside, of course, and also fire regulation, etc. But then it's sometimes like it's inside, and so we have this circulation around along the facade that goes around the building. Maybe one point about the structure, and we really want to emphasize this building as a kind of a infrastructural public building, and that's why the structure is very strong and very present. It was probably, I mean, the engineers tried to optimize it, so we had a big fight because we didn't want to optimize it, because of course the beams they diagonally, and oh, but why don't you put metal, etc., etc. And no, we really want to recreate this kind of effect of a kind of heaviness and kind of superposed public spaces. And this is the section of the building, and you see a little bit the staircase here, and we have, well, I don't have it here, I think. There's another section where actually there's a kind of big staircase here and a big staircase there. So, I mean, all the public space of the street and the public square we have on the south, when they really linked to this first floor, and then so then and they go up they go up the building. And then sometimes instead of saying, oh, let's program a few spaces that are wastelands, maybe the whole building could it be. This is a project, a competition we did in Brussels for a car dealer. I mean, but they said, okay, we want to we have workshops for cars, we want to sell cars, but maybe we want also other activities, maybe offices or maybe something else, because you know, maybe in 20 years we will sell less cars, or we'll sell them differently, or we'll sell them on the internet and we'll just come and pick them up here. So it was a real idea of rethinking what is a kind of a workspace, and how can you enter flexibility, but also different kind of users. So it is related to a kind of a project of Cedric Price, the Fun Palace, and we call this project the Fun Car Palace. I mean, it's really to say people and cars are the same. And actually now with electric cars, I mean, they could drive here and it wouldn't pollute, and you could drive at 5 kilometers per hour, so it would be the same. And so we try to find a system which could be highly flexible in a way to accommodate all the program, and say it can be used for cars or can be used for people. And so with this, we kind of build this kind of vertical towers, would be a kind of technical open floors. The building was 17 meters wide. Well, 17 if you look on the section below right, it's 17, and on the other side 17, and it had this kind of big inner space with workshop on the ground floor, and then kind of exhibition space on top. And then in these 17 meters, you could do a lot of things. It could be office, it could be workspace, it can be even a regular car park. And so that's why we kind of developed all these architectural elements that could be used all for cars, all for people, and then connect the two sides of the building. So actually we a lot of constraints as well inside the building. And actually it's interesting to think of freedom opposed to constraints, and I don't think we can have freedom if we don't have a certain number of constraints. So that's why we always try to, in a way, you know, when you start with a white page, okay, what are the constraints, and we kind of invent them, and then usually it kind of turns out that afterwards we can step back and find a kind of a way how to deal with freedom. And okay, it was just plans. And this is where some of the use we kind of imagined inside the building. It could be exhibition, it could be workspace, it could be or commercial or kind of sports equipment. So everything was possible, and it was probably a way a bit more too conceptual for the client, because he didn't really project, and but it was interesting as a research element. And it's really a question of how we deal with freedom and how we deal with these constraints, and how do we kind of interact with them. And you have the work here of Matthew Barney, and he, well, he made these kind of paintings, but always kind of his body was attached, always springs, always trampolines, kind of oh, back. So jumping on the ceiling to paint, or kind of having these strings. There was really almost kind of a physical relation between constraint and the freedom of creation. I know it is quite interesting. It's almost like the to evolve your body. And so on this project, we kind of thought it's a project in Brussels for a school, for a media school, and we said, I mean, this kind of big beam seems like a very big, but actually, for us, it was a kind of liberating, because it was for us a kind of a way to organize a program and to say, well, in the ground floor, we have more space, we put the bigger functions and the more public ones. And the more we go up, the more we are private, because on the very last floor, we have this very small video editing rooms for the students. So it was, for us, the constraint was interesting because it was a starting point to really invent the project and find out inside the project a lot of freedom of how we could place the functions and even probably interchange. I mean, it's not like having a free plan and do whatever you want. And I think it can really emphasize the functions also and the architecture. And also maybe how you use the building in maybe ways you didn't think of initially. Maybe we're going to talk now about the joyful runes. I mean, it's this is the work of a photographer, Toshio Shibata, and of infrastructural elements in Japan. And it's this kind of a structure that hold the mountains because they're fragile. And we always found these pictures very, very, very beautiful. Of course, they're beautiful pictures, but also because you have this kind of very nice, very detailed, very precise infrastructural design. And they're very precise and very, I mean, they're very beautiful. And also they kind of seems like they are kind of grow from the roads. Like, you know, they kind of, you have a road there and kind of grow on a mountain. It's kind of a symbol of, sorry. I press always on the wrong button. And they're almost like a symbol of modernity, you know, like of progress. And then they grow on the mountain, and it's like the relation between this kind of grid, like you have here, this kind of modern grid, growing from this infrastructural element, which is the road on the mountain, and it's quite interesting. And what is quite interesting is sometimes you don't really know if the grid was there before the landscape or the landscape came over the grid, because sometimes, you know, nature takes takes over anyway. And I think this contrast between progress and regress is quite amusing and quite interesting. For instance, here you have the nature on the top upper part, kind of entering the grid, and you don't really know if there was a grid before, if the grid came afterwards, the nature came before. So it's really kind of a interesting moment, I think, in architecture, because it kind of shows a kind of interesting relation between infrastructure and nature. And 2 years ago, we were invited to a competition in Belgium to build a church. And okay, it was an interesting subject because we never did one church. And it's a kind of a nice bucolic landscape. There is a small river, there are nice trees around, etc. It was really, really kind of a street, anyway, landscape, a bit wet. as well, because it was in the northern part of Belgium where there is kind of there's a lot of water there, close to the Netherlands, so it's really kind of a special mood. And we thought maybe we should kind of think the search as of a piece of landscape. So we thought of making a mountain, kind of a holy mountain, kind of a going from the flat landscape, flat Flemish landscape, and kind of lifting up. And you know, in the Alps you have a lot of crosses on the top of the mountains, but so it's fast to go there. It's maybe as important. Or if you think of the Mont Fuji, also a kind of a spiritual process to go to the top. So we decided to do this small piece of landscape of kind of mountain, but it's kind of you know, cut. It's 1/4 of a mountain, kind of cut piece of it, and it has two small windows on the two sides, and it had really a mountain shape on the other side. And this is some of the research of the idea of a mountain, and made us also think of you know, when you go hiking, you have this cairn, I don't know what it's called, when all the stones, you know, and it kind of it's a waypoint in the middle of the nature, and it kind of okay, this is where you have to go, and it's kind of a spiritual way to deal with this kind of with this path. It's also the idea of having how to build a cave, etc. It was really interesting, kind of experimental process of recreating a piece of landscape. And so this is the mountain from top, and I mean the real arrow is on top there, and then you had a small entrance on the path below, and then you had the inside of the church, and it wanted very moody, very dark. So we had only we had one door to enter, and kind of a big void inside. And this is the piece of landscape, and you see the surrounding is really kind of a wettish, kind of leaves, dry and grass field. So it was really kind of a moody piece, and a very it's maybe a bit exaggerated, very moody, very dark, but with two nice windows on this typical landscape. And then I think we're almost finished. There are other places which are quite interesting when you think of architectural places of freedom. And maybe the most famous, I mean, one of the most famous ones is maybe the Torre David in Caracas. And I know it was planned to be an office building, and the developer or died or went bankrupt, and so he left the building half built. And of course, it's a kind of a very bad social place. But when you think it's maybe also a very modern place, because you have a lot of open spaces, you can do sport inside, you have activities, you have housing that you can customize, you have a nice view on the surroundings. You can even go with your motorcycle to your apartment, have a view, and you can also do sports on the roof. So it's in a way a kind of a interesting modern building, and interesting that to see that this space that was supposed to be an office building became something completely different. And the question is, why does this space have the potential to become kind of a place of free experimentation? And that's some of the questions we ask ourselves. I mean, how can we do it? How can we kind of lay out a kind of a base of freedom inside our project? It's not freedom as, okay, I take away a straight angle and kind of a shape thing. It's like kind of an underlying pattern, underlying base that could be used for activities that we didn't think of. Okay, places that could evolve. but maybe also places that we didn't think of at all possible. And then you're surprised to see, oh, they did something out of it. And that is the kind of spaces that we try to investigate and try to kind of develop in our projects. And so we try to experiment this idea on a housing project in Paris, where we said, okay, maybe we should give the clients, or not the clients, but the people that were going to live there, to really customize their place. So it's a real small project, a kind of small plot, and it's made out of 3 small towers that are attached by exterior space. And the exterior space is kind of common. You have the staircase, you have the elevator, etc. And then we said, okay, maybe each person could kind of customize its own facade. And so it's a question about how living together but living separately. So it's a real question, especially in dense cities. So we developed a catalog of 24 different styles of facade. So we had probably a London style, we had a Paris style, we had a Tokyo style, maybe a Munich style, maybe, or maybe something, or Milano style. I don't know, we did really a lot. So the idea was that people could choose what they really wanted. And it was quite interesting, this kind of collage of the well, different kind of customizations according to what the people would want. And to finish, maybe a last practice of freedom that we kind of experimented is a project that you could assemble and disassemble. It is a music hall in Brussels, and it's a kind of an industrial neighborhood. And they had the idea of extending the project on the roof. That's why you see these kind of big beams on the roof, because it was able to support an extension. And so maybe we thought maybe we could develop a whole series of mechano elements in a way, well, a bit bigger, but that it could be, we don't see it, be used to mount and unmount the project to really kind of have an extension. Well, you don't see very much on the image here, but there is a kind of extension on the roof. And that's why we kind of developed the whole, kind of a whole catalog of pieces. And it's this kind of prefab industrial elements of rack elements you have in warehouses, etc. And maybe that's maybe another practice of freedom is like the building kind of rebuilds itself over and over and over again. And it was maybe also a way to deal with kind of a sustainable approach, is that you don't throw everything away, because you kind of use the whole building to almost remove one small part on the bottom and kind of have extension on top of the building. And yeah, I think this kind of practice of freedom is something that we kind of really try to experiment inside our projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yves, for this very inspiring lecture, because I think it opened up a lot of ideas, not only about your work, but more in general about how to manage the research in the design. There were very beautiful images on the landscape and the architecture, and I think also the discussion about the constraint and the freedom is quite urgent, especially I would say also dealing with the typology in a way, no? Because you never mentioned the word typology, but I think then it's a control. It's another lecture, but I think there is a very strong research on what does it mean to think about the contemporary approach on typology when we are dealing with different design questions. I would like to ask if there are questions from the students or from. Sure, Pedro.
First of all, congratulations, fantastic work, very nice presentation. Actually, I know it was a mistake, but I like to repeat because you should think that to do it really in purpose, to repeat the projects once again. Exactly, because I know it was not on purpose, but this repetition was really nice because your work is about repetition, and the freedom is coming from the repetition. The thing that it's not really a question, it's maybe more a thematic that we can discuss over the dinner or even with the students. But I was this feeling because I'm, as you know, from the south of Europe, we speak a lot about this kind of standardization, yes or no, how you can, and I love your freedom, if you want to use your words, how to use this new approach to the modern architecture. That it's super difficult to engage. There is, I don't know if you know, but probably you know, a lot of guys in Europe are speaking about a kind of meta modernism that I think you could fit quite well on this meta. And the thing that I'm always, it's not that I'm worried about, it's that I find it very exciting and interesting. But there is this kind of, it's not the same thing like it was in the past on the 60s, on the 70s, that Rainer Brahms write this letter saying that Italians were out with Ernest Rosen saying that it was very contextualist, so the history was important, the context was important, the site was important, and Brahms say fuck off the context. We want to do moving cities, and we want that the modernity be another thing. So what I'm actually trying to say is that how do you feel, or if I want to put it as a question, because it's not really a question, it's kind of more a debate than something else. Of course, I feel more like, even if I feel very fascinated with this type of approach, I would love to do it. I lived a few years in Holland, so I would still like to be on this kind of context. I always have this problem to be on context. They're super strong, not only in terms of finance. I know that you also have these constraints, but we have much more constraints. and I would like to know what is your approach to the modernity. Not so much about what is a modern project. And I know that modernity is very connected with freedom, and sometimes we kind of lose it. And I would like to hear a bit about what is for you the modernity of our times. I have to clarify. He's fucking me. So you're gonna have 2 hours? No, the modernity. I'm not referring to what is modern project. Okay, so that is a very serious. I'm speaking about modernity as a modern, in the sense that it's more connected with the civilization, with the relation. So it's much longer space. That some persons say that it starts in the Renaissance. Some persons say that, for example, Industrial Revolution, and so on. Persons say it's, when it's democratic, we have modernity. It's not modernity. It's complex and very dense with a lot of layer thing. It's not. I'm not referring to. I think you understood. I'm not referring, but I'm clarifying to Karim that it's. I'm not referring to Corbusier and the project. Okay.
I mean, it's a question we ask ourselves quite. How do we relate to modernity? Because we're always post, in a way, the previous movement. I mean, there have been so many prefixes to the modernity. So maybe today it's meta, maybe tomorrow it's something else. So what we try to, in a way, to investigate is, was there a way to not oppose the future and the past? So one moment we try to go back to what's the origin of modernity. So we did a lot of research, experimentation, and yeah, I don't know how to where we are actually today. I mean, because it's kind of an ongoing process. But I think we cannot fight against it. We shouldn't be too nostalgic about the past. So it's a question: how do we deal? We have to, in a way, to accept it, but and it's a real kind of a tricky process in a way, and about the context, I think we are very much contextual in our projects, because the only one that can understand us is usually the urbanist. Because when we have no urbanist on the site, we kind of lose always a competition, because I mean we don't know how to when there is no good urban planner, and it's a real disaster, because then you talk to a technician or whatever, and then you start dealing with, okay, I want my building to start a discussion with the urban context. And so actually all of the, I mean, I have the impression that all of the projects, even they might look a bit or masculine, or sometimes a bit virile, or a bit strict, or a bit kind of very strong proposal, but we feel they're very much in relation to the project, to the context, and to the program itself. And I mean, a project of Saclay, we probably couldn't do it in another location. We couldn't just take it and put it here and, oh, it functions. So, because it was really like the context that kind of said, okay, we had to superpose a very small site, etc., etc. And so I believe we're quite, we try to be. And usually when we win competition, because we do a lot of competition, when we win is when we have a discussion, a good relation with the urban planner. And then usually there is a kind of a really integration of the project into the surrounding. Yeah, I'm thinking of one thing we try to integrate as well in our projects is make them unfinished, and that's something and it's part of the discussion of freedom, and it's part of this discussion of progress and regress. It's like in a way like adolescents. No, they don't know if they want to grow, or if they want to stay a child. And this kind of state of project is interesting. And actually, when you're on a construction site, it is interesting to see when just the concrete is finished, and that's it. And you don't know if the project is in a state of destruction, if it's a ruin, or if it's in a state of construction. And this is a moment that is very, very exciting. And we like to play a little bit on this kind of subtle moment. And that's why we in a way, we try to the buildings unfinished. It's not always easy, because the client doesn't understand, but it usually kind of makes it more interesting. And this, I mean, all these inner wastelands within Saclay or in Montpellier as well, where we have unprogrammed spaces. I think they're quite interesting, but then we're not sure how they're going to evolve. We're not sure how we're going to react when they will evolve. And then there's a question: do you let the baby, grow by itself or not? And that's a kind of a funny moment, and sometimes a quite strong discussion.
Thank you. I was really impressed by your presentation, and I would like to share you something, because normally we are used, once we think about freedom in contemporary architecture, to see an approach where architecture in itself, with the tools to work forms and spaces is a little bit not legitimized any longer, whereas in your approach, this is not happening, because I want to stress that once you mention the church, you start from a concept, then you take these fragments within the concept, and then you play with different configuration where structure, material, and space are. So I think that about this question, we should really reflect a lot, because it's definitely this probably that brings you far away from the modern approach, going back to the question of Pedro. But on the other side, I would like to stress for the students who are here, the fact that mentioning freedom in architecture means that to establish, in a way, some rules, being able to jump in another position and to break them. That's why you make this Peter Pan metaphor. But for me, it's important that space is formed, and also this use of the concept, which is normally three-dimensional, it's something that it's working very strong, and it's something that students should really not renounce to do. Whereas sometimes we say freedom is no architecture, which is not your case. That's when, yeah.
I mean, you mentioned typologies a bit earlier, and of course, I mean, you don't talk about typologies, but I mean, I didn't talk about typologies, and I didn't talk so much about publicness, because I mean, we have many kind of research subjects here I focus, but I mean, we always try in all the projects to work with public. What's the public part of a building? It can be even for housing. I mean, what's the public part? It can be, if it's a school, okay, it's a public building, but what's the public part of the building? And so, but what's publicness? What does it mean? Does it mean how you see the people move inside the building? Do you see how you use it? Do you see how it's connected to the urban space? So there are different ways how to make a project public, even if it's very private. Is it a relation to the surrounding? Is it because it's completely full of glass and just you're inside the landscape and you feel very public? Or is it because you make a platform 20 meters high with a staircase, a nice view on the surrounding, and wow, it's an incredible public space. And so the kind of publicness, it's something we try in each project to work, and it's very much related to typologies. Because when we work on projects, I mean, we don't like to design facades. I mean, we don't like to design details. Because if the whole project just can be resumed to a very small detail and everything should work because of this detail, I mean, if on construction the detail fails, I mean, the whole project fails. And so that's a kind of risk we don't want to take, because, I mean, we're not in Switzerland, you know, when you don't know how the concrete is going to be cast, you don't know how the metal, etc., etc. I mean, it's France, it's like, depending on the companies, it's kind of a tender, and you don't know exactly what you're going to get. So, well, okay. Okay. I compare to Switzerland, to Germany, where everything, and yeah, so we really try to work on a strong conceptual typological building. And it's how do you move the building? How is the vertication? How is the horizontal vertication? Where are the functions? In the building, we can the whole function down. So we said, okay, we want the basketball on the roof. Okay, but where do you put all the technical stuff? You know, all the ventilation, etc. Because you want basketball. What do? Shit, you have problem. And then you say, okay, I want my restaurant, but kind of a bit higher level. Oh, but then you need a kitchen as well. Oh, but the plot is so small, you don't have space for all the kitchen. How do you do? Suddenly you have 2 levels. And then the 2 levels, you have the technical space you couldn't put on the roof. So it started being a very complex puzzle, technically difficult, technically not according to the building rules, where you have to kind of cheat and convince everyone because it's not in the book. That it shouldn't function like that. And I think we were, in a way, quite lucky that during the whole design process, they didn't really realize how difficult the project was, how complex it was. And then it was construction. And then, you know, in France, you have this kind of technical controller that kind of supervises a bit for the client, all the technical parts. And he was embarrassed because he didn't see all the problems before. So when we were in construction side, it was like, okay, well, let's do it like this. And then, so we found solutions. And also, for instance, the beams, they are quite low. And I think they're 2 meters 20 from the floor. I really like it because it's like feeling, you know, the heaviness of the structure and we're really close. But it should be 2 meters 25 or 2 meters 30 according to the rules. But I mean, when he came for the construction site, it was like, it was already in place. He couldn't say like, okay, let's demolish everything. So we kind of played on a few, I mean, elements as well to really make sure that this kind of, we try to experiment were quite strong, and that the typology and the publicness of the building kind of prevailed on the whole architectural design. It should be stronger. It should, and I mean, of course, I mean, for instance, if you, I mean, we didn't show, but I mean, on the in Montpellier, I think we did 300 kinds of facades, and we didn't know how to choose. And so, I mean, then if you draw so many facades, it's like, there's something wrong. So you have to think of. So then we started to work from inside, and this full of chess board typology, and then it's the idea that, I mean, didn't explain, but that you can cross the whole ground floor inside this chess. So you have this kind of two directions, north, south, and in the middle, in the crossing, you have the forum. So it's kind of a Italian way of the Cardo and the Cumanus, and in the middle you had the forum. So it was kind of something that when we explained the project, for instance, to the mayor and to the urban planner, I mean, they were convinced because for them it was the beginning of a story. It's the beginning of a city. And so then again, the project became contextual because it was Mediterranean, and then it functioned. But of course, we need to have a good clients and good urban planners and understand this ideas. But indeed, I think it's very much work on the typologies.
Thank you so much. I think maybe we can close here and we can continue over dinner. So thank you so much. Thank you. Veramente very, very interesting.